I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Last year, Guillermo del Toro did something that Steven Spielberg, William Friedkin, M. Night Shyamalan, and Darren Aronofsky were not able to do. He shattered that plate glass ceiling that has always left horror in the just happy to be nominated level, and he took home the big prize, Best Picture. We took home the big prize. We horror fans. Because even though Silence of the Lambs won Best Picture in 1991, the artists distanced themselves from the horror label and, by default, horror fans. Guillermo del Toro not only acknowledged fans, he damn well invited us up on the stage with him. He talked directly to us from the stage, and he told us he unlocked the secret door, and we were welcome to kick it in and tell our stories. And that's what's always been special about Guillermo del Toro. He's always been one of us, a fan and a nerd, and he's been proud enough about his geek love that he always treated it with the respect that art should be given. He is the intelligent and artful outsider many of us wish we could be. And yet, I've been very surprised at how silent the horror community has been about Guillermo del Toro since he won Best Picture. I was surprised how little his name came up at a recent horror convention. In fact, I went to one just weeks after the Academy Awards, and it was very, very obvious how little he was being spoken of. It's as if a switch had been flicked in fandom, and there's been this distancing from Guillermo del Toro. And I think that's something I wanted to talk about because Guillermo del Toro is not only a horror filmmaker, he's an ambassador for the horror fan. And I think perhaps it's time we take a look at the body of work he's made and the contributions he's made to monster kids like me and fandom moving forward. And my guest today is John Arminio, a horror and comic book superfan. John has been on the show to talk about faith and fiction and horror films previously, and he was also a member of our 50th episode panel. John, thanks so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. It's an honor to be back.
Thanks. So considering the episodes that you've been on, I mentioned that you were on a show about faith, and I don't know if there's a better match to talk about Guillermo del Toro between that and the comic book sensibilities and the comic book adaptations that he's done. So I guess my first question is to see if there's any validity to my sense that the pop cultural response to Del Toro in the past year has been underwhelming. Do you think that there's been less fanfare or interest from the horror community than what was expected?
I definitely agree. Because not only did The Shape of Water really have the kind of cultural competition of Get Out, which really kind of hit America like a lightning bolt. I think also, especially after this year's Academy Awards, I think the artistic credibility of the Academy is almost at an all-time nadir, like after giving the Best Picture to Green Book. Like, so does that mean The Shape of Water is just as artistically valid as Green Book? I kind of don't think so. But also, I think it's difficult to judge Guillermo del Toro's influence on horror fandom as a whole from a convention perspective, because I think a lot of the movies that are celebrated there tend to be easily quantifiable franchises like Friday the 13th or other slasher films. I mean, I know you've done a lot of podcast interviews from things like Women in Horror Festival, which caters more towards independent cinema, which I think is a totally different bag. But I think sometimes fandom can dismiss a filmmaker like Guillermo del Toro, who is difficult to quantify. Everybody thinks of George Romero as the guy from the Night of the Living Dead, but he had a lot of other things to say, whether that's your cup of tea or not. It's not everything that he did.
Right. And you brought up the Oscars, and of course I started with talking about it, and I certainly don't want to dismiss Get Out's power and impact. I think in a way, rightfully so, the amount of energy that Jordan Peele is getting makes sense, because I consider Get Out the modern version of Night of the Living Dead, whereas I don't think that Shape of Water per se on cultural impact would be quite at the same level. I'm not saying anything about quality or value of either of the films. And I think you bring up a very interesting point about the Oscars. One of the pieces that I think is important is that I don't think because Guillermo del Toro won an Oscar, he's suddenly a great artist that he wasn't before.
Yeah, exactly.
The Oscar itself, the gold statue, isn't nearly as important as what it can represent. But when we talk about del Toro, and you mentioned fandom in and of itself, and I use that term very broadly, kind of like how I do horror. When I'm talking about the aficionados. I'm talking about the cineasts as well as the people who are absolutely in love with Freddy and Jason, and that's as far as they want to go. I think it's all one big family. But I've noticed that the people who really get into critical detail have kind of stopped talking about Del Toro. And that really surprised me because he was talked about so much on the way up, if you want to call it that, through the years, the slog of not having that many great horror films happening in the 90s. He was still pushing things forward. And we would hear his name quite often at conventions, and now it just seems as if there's a little bit of a dearth in the conversation. So do you have any theories about why you think that's happening?
Well, I do think there is a little bit of joy any cineast can take by talking about a movie that isn't mainstream. I like to be honest. So, and especially when a lot of his most celebrated movies, up until and including Pan's Labyrinth, were in Spanish. The fact that you are talking about these very strange, very almost these kind of mytho-Freudian explorations of horror, it got you some underground street cred, and it's just not there anymore because he has Pacific Rim, he has an Oscar win, and so there's just not that sort of energy to champion his films unless you're a big old nerd like me.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Spanish films because I'll probably be going to quotes from Del Toro often through this because I do think that he is so great at being able to really speak eloquently about the artistry of horror, the sense of emotion that's there, but also cut away some of the bullshit. And so when we talk about the Spanish movies, he has a quote where he says, people say, I like your Spanish movies more than I like your English language movies because they are not as personal. And I say, fuck, you're wrong. Hellboy is as personal to me as Pan's Labyrinth. They're tonally different. And yes, of course, you can like one more than the other. The other one may seem banal or whatever it is that you don't like, but it really is part of the same movie. You make one movie. Hitchcock did one movie all his life. And I think after spending, we're going to try and talk about 5 different films in Del Toro's long list, you feel that there's this one movie coming. And it's also kind of like really a wave that comes over you. But I really felt that you could feel the heart of the romantic after looking at all these films. Yeah. He's always led with his heart. And he's a geek for anything from Frankenstein to Walt Disney. What do you think is his most endearing quality as an artist?
Yeah, I think it is his enthusiasm for everything, for so much, from the grimiest Italian giallo to Disney, to his ability to talk about symbolist painting, to his ability to get his hands dirty in the filmmaking process. Like, he loves every bit of it. And that's something that you don't see a lot in directors who kind of have to give off this persona of being too cool for school and being in charge, but he's willing to dive in like the most enthusiastic 12-year-old into all these things he loves. And it gives him, it gives a lot of his films this sort of unabashed romanticism and sentimentality. Like, he's able to, but through that he's able to imbue his films with a sense of beauty that I think a lot of other filmmakers aren't able to achieve.
I agree. I think what's interesting and what I really love about him and what you hit on is that he has this 12-year-old love. In other words, everything that he loved at the age of 12, he's still carrying a torch for. But he doesn't just stop with the idea of, I like red. The color
Yeah.
red's really great. Instead, he does what I think is so exciting, is that he comes up with the why. The why is always so important to me. It's not like, yeah, I like red. He goes, what was the first thing that I saw that was red that was so exciting? And that brings it to being more than just a list of things. It's more than just a dusty room full of collectibles that he may have. It brings it into a vibrant life, and it taps into where I was at 12. I find that what he does in his conversations is he unlocks the parts of me that I've forgotten about. I was watching a documentary or an interview where he was going through Bleak House, and he has this secret room, which is a bookcase that opens up, and it's all Disney's Haunted Mansion. And I don't usually talk about Disney at all. And then I saw that room and I went, yeah, I love the Haunted Mansion too. I was like, I want to go. I'm going to go to LA soon. Maybe I'll go just to see the Haunted Mansion. And it keys in on all what he loves about the Haunted Mansion is his own, that he can speak about. But what it did is it reminded me of what I really connected to, which is this spectacle, the detail, the obvious love of the over-the-top joy that Disney tried to put in this 999 spirits that are inside this basically mechanical event that you're being carted through. But it has this whole wonderful joy to it. And I think that Del Toro unlocks that over and over again by being honest and intelligent about what he's talking about when he deals with that stuff. And I love that I'm able to find that. And I think that's one of the things that he champions so well for the film lover, is that it's not just, oh, and I love this. It's also, we'll be reverent about it, but we'll also open up some doors about why this stuff is so interesting. Now, you, John, we've discussed your Catholic faith previously in episodes and how that has been a way for you to look at certain films from a certain aspect. Also, you were able to speak about how some movies show spirituality. And I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about that here, because I think that makes for a pretty good match with Del Toro, who has a very complicated relationship with his Catholicism and with his Christianity. Yeah. But do you see his Catholic faith, whether it be complicated or not, as one of the paintbrushes that he uses to color his art?
I mean, I definitely do. I mean, especially in like his first movie in Kronos, you have a guy named Jesus Christ die
Right.
and come back to life. It's kind of like a little on the nose there, and that's one of those movies that deals with the sacredness of blood, the purification through spirituality. It opens with uh, a narration about the Spanish
Right.
Inquisition. In Devil's Backbone, the kids carry a cross across a deserted field and say, "Oh, this guy's heavy." There's a metaphor in there somewhere. Uh, and Hellboy's constantly carrying a rosary around. So even in the most comic booky realm, there's he's the titular devil hero is using sacred relics to accomplish his mission. So I think his Catholicism is kind of central, not central, but one of the base pillars of where he gets his imagery from.
Yeah, it's like Scorsese's
Mm-hmm.
Catholicism. And it's kind of like Scorsese's New York. It has a
Yeah.
certain color to it that will always frame his films, as long as they're taking place in New York, that is. So you mentioned Kronos. I will say that is how I first came to know anything about Guillermo del Toro. I was at a video store in the 90s during what I consider the great drought of horror films. And 1993 was really interesting because I'm pretty sure it's the same year that Larry Fessenden's Habit came out. But I found out about Larry Fessenden and I found out about Guillermo del Toro at the same time at a video store. And I saw the box for Kronos and I had no idea what I was getting into. And by the 15-minute mark, I was going, this we're on to something completely new, something completely interesting and enriching. That was my first kiss. What was your first kiss with Del Toro?
My first kiss with Del Toro was definitely Hellboy.
Mm-hmm.
That was a movie that came out when I was 20, and I needed that movie when I was 20 years old because, at that time I was in college and I was too cool for school. I was taking an art of film class. I was seeing Kurosawa and Bergman movies for the first time, and I needed somebody with the power and majesty of Del Toro to like bring me back to the way I was when I was 12 and be like, John, maybe you're disillusioned with Star Wars right now. These prequels are garbage, but they're still fun because they were coming out at that time. But there's still some fun, unabashed glee you can get from cinema, and so that's what Hellboy was able to give me. And so I'll always have a personal connection with that movie in particular.
I think that's something that's really intriguing about Del Toro as well, is that he's pretty egalitarian. He's kind
Mhm.
of just one of the guys, and he's not making movies that are untouchable for people who just want to have some fun. Yet he respects the audience enough to say, you know what? You can have a little bit more going on. I think he calls it eye protein as opposed to eye candy. Whereas he says that eye candy is the kind of thing that you see in a movie that, it's superfluous to the plot, but it feeds your eyes, it feeds you visually. Whereas eye protein is something beautiful, technically complex, but it tells a story. Like Frankenstein, Godzilla, monsters serve a more symbolic function to illuminate the human condition. And I think he allows us to not only go back to that 12-year-old and say, yeah, there's fun in cinema again. It's not always going to be, about Bergman to be good. And yet he still gives us a little Bergman. He still gives us that stuff because he respects the audience enough to be able to allow them the opportunity to take that in. Or that's the one part that he's not thoroughly egalitarian. He goes, fine, catch up with me, folks, because I can't just do this one thing.
Yeah, I mean, like in Kronos, you know, Jesus experiences the stigmata throughout the movie. So like the beetle, the vampire mechanical
Mm-hmm.
device, clockwork bug, which we'll see again and again throughout his films.
Yes.
Um, it bites him in the hand, and so he has that proportion of the stigmata, and then later he gets a wound in the side that people kind of stick their hands into, like Saint Thomas. Like you don't need those moments to have a vampire movie. But because
Right.
of Del Toro's methodology of giving you eye protein, it is an extra layer you can indulge in if you so choose to.
And since we're talking about the movies and we brought up Kronos a couple times, let's delve into that a little bit. The idea of time, I mean, Kronos time is huge in this movie. The idea of clockwork, and I think you talked about the very beginning of the movie where we have this narration fleeing from the Inquisition. An alchemist, Organelli is the guy's name. He's found in 1937, 400 years later, just crushed in a wall that collapsed, and he's pierced. I think his chest is mortally pierced with a piece of the building. His last words are suo tempore, which is in his own time. Who do you think is the his?
I think in that case we're probably referring to Christ the Lord, but I think also that has a double meaning because our protagonist is named Jesus, and he sort of at the end chooses to die rather than you drink from his own granddaughter. So he chooses to sacrifice himself in order to save her. So that is the time of his own choosing. So the opening moments really sort of presage the ending sequence of that film.
And it also sets a tone. I mean,
Yes.
when we're talking about horror films, especially say in the early 90s, there wasn't that much of a supernatural thing that was going on. And there wasn't anything that was kind of an exclamation point. The very opening of that film, where the police are going into the old gallery studio and there are people dangling upside down, being drained of their blood, and they're keeping it quiet. It was such a vivid thing. He doesn't shy away from the horror elements. So there's still an amazing brutality and an amazing imagery that is very much gothic. And I think if there's one thing that I got out of my religious experience and upbringing was a sense of the Gothic. How do you feel about the movie Kronos? I mean, it's his early effort. He doesn't even call it his first film. He saves that for Devil's Backbone.
I really love Kronos. I think it's him at his most kind of bare and raw, and we see his themes very kind of obvious. We see things that reoccur later, like the kind of even imagery like the porcelain faced statue cracked in the
Right.
cheek, which we'll see in Devil's Back. When we see that in Kronos, we see, clockwork. So, the symbol of this non-linear symbol for time in the gears of the clockwork. And we see Ron Perlman collaborating with Guillermo del Toro for the first time in a very kind of raw, emotionally bare performance as this asshole named Angel.
Yeah.
And the score is beautiful, but it's really kind of on the nose and obvious throughout the whole movie. But for me, to give a comic book metaphor, it's like Iron Man's first suit, that kind of like hulking
Right.
gray massive thing that Tony Stark kind of had to weld from the rock wall out of sheer will. So that's what this movie is to me, and so I can't not love it. Even if it's not as elegant as Devil's Backbone or Shirley Pan's Labyrinth, there's still so many things that I get from it again and again. And the acting is fantastic from the entire cast. There's some great, like, delicious villain moments. He keeps his organs in jars and shows them to
Right.
people. Like, there's just some great moments in this film, and the Gothic architecture, the antiquarium shop that's so interesting, and the fairy tale aspect of the granddaughter. Like, I just find so many things to keep going back to in this film.
Yeah, I really like Kronos a lot, and I've heard people say that they don't feel that it's a very strong film, and I don't know. It's one of my favorites, and I love the imagery that you're talking about as well. And I want to get back to the clock thing, because after watching 5 movies in a row, I would swear that he was a clockmaker, Del Toro, with how much time is involved and how many obvious watches and clocks there are, but also not so obvious timepieces like the bomb that's slowly ticking in Devil's Backbone, and the idea of the office of the fascist in Pan's Labyrinth is basically an unmoving watch. He's got a stopwatch that's dead in his hand from his father, but he is also living in one. The room looks like cogs. What do you think the fascination is with time and or that mechanism?
It it seems almost to me antithetical to so many of the things he's done. Because let me find the quote here. This is going to Shape of Water, but he talks about Michael Shannon's character Strickland as representing 3 things Del Toro finds terrifying: order, certainty, and perfection.
Right.
So that's a pretty accurate way to describe a clock. And so for a horror filmmaker to constantly putting those images in his films, I think, well, maybe he's putting things in his film that scare him.
Well, that's interesting that you would mention that, because I think it kind of goes with what he talked about with Hitchcock, where Hitchcock always had the same blonde. He
Mhm.
always had the same voyeurism that's going through all of his films. And there's a love-hate that was going on with Hitchcock, and perhaps there's that same kind of thing with Del Toro. What I think is interesting about that scarab beetle, which I thought was one of the coolest looking things ever, the scarab that is in
Yeah.
Kronos, is that it is a living thing as well. And I just read Don Coscarelli's book, True Indie, and he talks about sitting at a Masters of Horror dinner with John Carpenter and John Landis, and Guillermo del Toro's there. And Del Toro comes over to him and he goes, my scarab in Kronos, it's based on the silver sphere from Phantasm. He goes, that whole idea was so friggin' cool. So I love that it's, once again, something that fascinated him, and he personalized it in a way. And I think the personalization is interesting. So Del Toro has said that the Kronos relationship that's in there between grandfather and granddaughter is actually his grandmother and him, because
Hmm.
he was brought up by her. And I think it's really interesting that he changes the sex. So you have, instead of a maternal, he goes for the paternal. And it seems like there's fathers that are always important through the film through his films, and that there's dual fathers, or there's a search for fathers, so there's the abandonment. And he had his father kidnapped after Kronos was made. I think he was starting to work on Mimic, and one of the big things that happened in his life was this huge trauma that his father was kidnapped by Mexican thugs for 72 days, and they asked for over $1 million. And James Cameron, of all people, came up with $1 million to give him because they were friends. And he never got that money back, and they never caught these guys. How much do you think that personal trauma or personal traumas show up again and again in his films?
I think that definitely has an impact, because I think if you look at the way the father figure represented in Pan's Labyrinth, it's a figure of sheer terror. But also in Hellboy, where John Hurt is this incredibly kind and wise, and everything you would want from an elderly paternal figure, but he is brutally gutted by a mechanical Nazi who breaks into his home. Like filming
Right.
filming that sequence, Del Toro had to be thinking about the experience of his own father and what could have happened. And so I don't think that moment could have been as horrifying if he, or it certainly would have played itself out differently if he hadn't had that personal experience.
So there's a ton of great visual imagery, and there's the beginning of a lot of these themes that's in Kronos. And then he moves forward to Devil's Backbone, which I certainly wanted to talk about. So the Devil's Backbone, essentially, it's a movie that's both a ghost story and a disturbing look at the monsters that wars created. It takes place at the end of the Spanish Civil War. Can you give a little bit of an overview of the plot, or where the setting is and what's going on?
Sure. Yeah, it's set in the 30s during the Spanish Civil War, and our central characters are a newly acquired orphan at this orphanage who has to survive on his own now, through the abuse of his peers at the orphanage, and also being sort of terrorized by one of the employees, Jacinto, who is a very cruel master, I suppose. But through that, he's sort of guided and helped by the doctor who works at the orphanage, the matron of the orphanage, who is hiding a sort of treasure that she hopes to help fund the communist rebels who are fighting against Franco's fascists. And kind of throughout, the kids are actually helped by the ghost who sighs, to try and extricate themselves from the fascist menace.
Wonderful. And I love that you say the ghost, that size. That's one of the things that I love about Del Toro's work over and over again, is that he puts in these feelings of myth, or feelings of legends, like the idea that there's gold in them, their orphanages. There's that old thing of people who are going into sacred places because they think that there's something that they can take, and they defile it, and it becomes a punishment. There's the idea of a ghost that sighs, this romantic idea that there's a gatekeeper. In Pan's Labyrinth, there's the three fairies. We'll get back to Pan later, but there's this whole idea that he brings myth and legend as if these are old wives' tales and stories that are being told, and it has a cumulative effect through his films, that they're not just horror movies. They feel like almost passed down stories, once again filtered in a different way for him to be able to tell a specific story. Another quote of his, because Devil's Backbone is probably, it depends on which one. Like, I watched Pan's Labyrinth after I watched Devil's Backbone. So Pan's Labyrinth is the one that I'm going crazy for. But Devil's Backbone is the one I keep coming back to, because I think it really hits on the monster even though it's such an elegant and streamlined monster, I think it's the first time that he really hits on this idea that he has about monsters. And what he says is that, like a piece of art, a glance at the monster tells you its story and purpose and what it represents. The monster also needs to be of a piece with all the other elements, both visual and aural. The world needs to be an ecosystem that works with the monster. At the center of the bullseye is the fantastic, the monster. Every other concentric circle is production design, wardrobe, color palette, and light. All of them give oxygen to that central circle, the fantastic. So we have in the ghost that size a tragic story about a beating and a drowning. And when we see this ghost, he has this, it's such an awesome image. A porcelain doll, basically. He looks like a porcelain doll, this cracked, pale face, still dressed in his school clothes, and he has this huge hole in his head, and there is red mist, blood, constantly floating upwards as if he's constantly underwater. And water is all through this movie, even when it's not there. Del Toro talks about how he spent days with the set design, making salt marks that were waves on all of the walls, so that you were always getting this background feeling that you were underwater. That's why this weird wisp of blood, not just as a ghostly memory, but also as a motif that could realistically be seen because of how he does the set decoration and how there's this weird water basin that's always there. And I think when he talks about how things can mean more than one thing, which is basically what he's saying about the monster, is that I think this movie really does a great job on that, because he talks about what are ghosts. And ghosts are, this unanswered question, this unfinished business. And he talks more than once in his films about the Spanish Civil War, and he considers that unfinished business. He considers that something that, because of World War II, it never got thoroughly understood or noticed. It kind of got brushed underneath by something much, much larger. And so it's like the national, not shame, but it's the thing that doesn't get talked about. And so he puts that as a ghost as well. Franco's army, somewhere in the distance, we hear the noises. We never see them, but they're coming. And everybody that works at that orphanage knows that Franco is coming and he's going to take them out. And so we have this, I think it's the beginning of something that I'll ask you what you think it's all about. Blindness, eye damage, eye wounds, and people saying shut up, not wanting to talk about the problem. So anytime that Santi is the child who becomes the ghost that sighs, every time he's brought up, everybody, the people who are in charge of the orphanage and the kids, all say shut up, don't talk about it. So it's like this thing of not wanting to see or being blinded that happens through his films. What do you think about that specifically, say for this movie?
Well, I'm also, my mind's racing because I'm connected to all those other films, but
I know.
yeah, for this movie specifically, I think these characters, their world is so isolated that they can't see outside of it, whether that's, because of the orphanage that's surrounded by desert, for miles and miles and miles around, or that their whole existence is so limited. So you have these wicked characters like Jacinto, who only sees his end goal. He's more blind than any of those other kids are, because their eyes are actually open to the reality of things, and that includes this tragic figure of a ghost. So I think those characters are being told to shut up, to be silent, because they're actually seeing the world for how it is. And a fascist does not want you to see the world the way it is. They want you to see their world and see their vision. And I think us as moviegoers are privileged to see this world through Guillermo del Toro's eyes, because for Santi, he self-consciously goes against the dictum of keep the monster hidden, show less. You see Santi real quick and you see him fully framed in a doorway, peering through the window like a porcelain doll. So we know him, we know Santi. So we're able to get sympathy for him very quickly through the movie. There's not this big turn at the end where we feel sorry for him. We feel sorry for him very fast. And we're then conditioned to view anyone who abuses these kids as the real monster, which is, I think, the way the narrative then flows from the second act onward.
I think that's one of the great things about this as well. It's not just a ghost story, and it's not just talking about fascism. It has a very strong heart for the kids by being cruel to the kids. What I love is, once again, going to that 12-year-old. He remembers what it's like to be a young kid, that your friends and your enemies can be the same person given the day, whichever way the wind blows, when you're kind of confined in this area where this is your ecosystem. This is everybody that you know. And so you have these heartfelt, tragic things like the Dr. Caceres and I'm forgetting the name of the woman who was the matron.
Mercedes.
Mercedes. They have all of these letters from dead parents. If the kids are orphans, chances are the parent is dead, or the parent has written letters after they have abandoned them. And they have all these, and they're giving them out to the kids. And the parents, even if they're still breathing, are nothing but ghosts, their memories. But she meters these things out to make it seem like they're still alive. So you have these kids looking over these notes saying, my mom wrote me. She says she's getting better, which breaks my heart every time I hear it. It's a moment that doesn't need to be in there, and yet it's so important because it talks about the cruelty of war. It talks about the survival. It talks about the resilience of hope and children. And I think that this is a movie that's there's a ton of violence and there's a ton of danger. These kids live with a damn unexploded bomb in their courtyard and play around it. And yet the danger is not only this unexploded bomb and Franco coming from the desert, but it's also themselves, that someone in their midst is going to start killing a lot of them because of a greed, an inability to understand who he is or where he is, what his standing is. And he's easily taken to the dark side, for lack of a better way to say it. You have this phantom army, and he's heard enough about it. I also think what's really interesting is that you don't have a straight setup hero in this. You have the observer child, who is our window into this, but you have, say, the doctor, who once again has things in jars. I mean, him and organs in jars. That's another Del Toro thing. He's this guy who was a revolutionary. He's now doing this thing that seems as if it's for the good of the children, but he also keeps the world from the children. And in the end, when the world is coming for him and he's wounded, one of the things that he says to the kids is, I never did anything. I never did enough. I stood around, is basically what he says. Mm-hmm. And he realizes he's going to take this stand at that point. So there's so much flaw that are in these characters that I think is really intriguing. What would, if you had to tell somebody a good, strong reason to watch Devil's Backbone, what would you do or say?
I would say this is sort of a master class in creating sympathy for the other in a film. And so whether that be people different from you or a ghost, this is something that just creates so much sorrow and like heart-rending sadness for the fate of these children, for the fate of this ghost child, that it's hard to fathom. But thankfully, through this film, we're able to kind of gather ourselves and see the effect of fascism on a country, because like it's an amputated leg's worth of gold, like
right.
and that's a wonderful image in and of itself. Like it's straight out of myth and fairy tales and all that stuff. And so to integrate that into a story of the Spanish Civil War is, I think, genius. but like weighed against the lives of children, like who cares? It's heavy metal, like in that's hiding in a woman's leg, but you're gonna
Right.
take that and let children be murdered or murder them yourselves because of money. Like, get out of here. And so to see that illustrated so pointedly and so elegantly, I think it is what makes this an essential horror film.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And with all of that said, why I think it's also so incredible and why I think Del Toro is such a great artist is we're getting all of that out of there because we're insane. But you can literally watch this movie and just see a great ghost story
Yes.
told in
With
at a certain
beautiful
time
production
period.
design, beautiful acting, and so even just on the surface level, it's worth watching.
I think this is the movie where he solidifies a color palette
Mhm.
that works by movie, and it's just really a wonderfully strong microcosm. So he has said in his acceptance speech, "I've been saved and absolved by them, the monsters, because monsters are the patron saints of our blissful imperfections." And I can't think of a better way to introduce someone that I think you're going to have a lot of fun talking about, Hellboy. In the absence of light, darkness prevails. And, the blissful imperfections from Karloff's Frankenstein on, we have empathized or felt a kinship with the deformities of the monster. So let's talk about one of the most deformed looking guys that there is. I mean, we have a hell spawn, basically, a demon who's going to be our hero slash anti-hero, but he's also cutting off the horns that he has. He's Americanized after 50 years of being on this side of the portal. Bring a comic book to live action before Marvel Universe really kicks in, but he's kind of hitting before the big push happens because I think part two. The Golden Army came out at the same time Iron Man did. And I think
Mhm.
Iron Man is like Anno Domini in BC. You
Yeah.
have before Iron Man and then after Iron Man. But he was kind of putting up a language long before Iron Man actually takes the center stage. As a comic book lover, how close did he come to the look of Mike Mignola's Dark Horse comics?
I think this is one of the greatest comic book adaptations ever made. To me, it's also like the ultimate B movie. One shining example of that is the subway fight between Hellboy and the
Mhm.
Samael, the resurrected.
Sammy.
Yeah. To me, this is like Jack Kirby animating a Ray Harryhausen monster, or Ray Harryhausen animating a Jack Kirby drawing. Like, it's so comic booky, but also so cinematic at the same time. It's a whole scene of exclamation points, like a Jack Kirby sequence. Big rock fist punching a tentacled squid monster dog. It's totally great, and so from that perspective, it translates a comic book perfectly, in my opinion. And I'm a huge Mike Mignola fan. Like, the way he draws his fight sequences, I think it has the dynamism of nobody's since Kirby. But also he has this sort of elegant simplicity in his drawings, in his use of color, in his line work that is unparalleled. Like, there's so much he gets out of the image from so little touches of the pen to page that is unparalleled. And to get that look, that color palette of elegant simplicity of the profile of Hellboy with the overcoat in an arch, that sort of thing. It's about tone and feel and look that I don't think any other comic book movie has even approached until like maybe like Logan or Thor Ragnarok. And even those were made out of pastiches of various works, whereas I think Hellboy is a distillation of Del Toro's sensibilities and Mignola's sensibilities in one film. I think Hellboy 2 is a much more Del Toro movie, but the first one is this incredible synthesis of filmmaker and comic book artist.
That's what I was interested to talk about because, I love, I could talk about the poetry that I see in the sequel. But here, there's that spirit that I felt. And you mentioned how it's kind of an equal dose of the two artists, the comic book artist and the film artist. There's a ton of, once again, Catholic imagery and
Yes.
Christianity that's in this. Spears that pierce Christ's side are there, and the huge revolver is the Samaritan, and the bullets are full of holy water, clover leaves, and white oak, which is really interesting because it's not all Christianity. It's almost like this weird pagan thing that's also there. It's kind of throwing in this strange stew of anything that has power because we believe in it can actually be used as a defense
Yeah,
mechanism.
what's more
Now, what's
pagan
all
than Rasputin summoning a
right,
creature from hell in order to bring down a squid god from space?
right, exactly. As much Christian imagery there's a ton of Lovecraft. There's some crazy pagan stuff that's going on in there. How much of that was in the comic? Or is that something that Del Toro brought to the films? Because I've always wondered if this is like the perfect marriage of piece and artist.
Uh, there's definitely a combination of pagan imagery, fairy tale and folklore, and Christian imagery in Mignola's work, and a ton of Lovecraft in there as well, because all that space squid stuff, the Orgdu Jihad, that
Right.
that is straight from uh, the Hellboy books. There's werewolves and vampires, but also the Baba Yaga is a huge villain in the Hellboy books and stories that seem like it's a retelling of Red Riding Hood with sentient werewolves, and there's trips to Africa and years spent underwater, and of course all these Lovecraftian influences are in the book as well, and so for someone like me who has a fascination with mythology and folktale, Hellboy is the perfect superhero to try and combat those wicked forces, and maybe find sympathetic heroes in there as well, because I think, like Del Toro, there's also a fascination with sort of aberrant technology, like gaseous sentient beings held in glass tubes, clockwork men set about to
Right.
do their nefarious business, like these sort of kind of primitive cyborg creatures, made out of rust and iron. Like, that's a very Del Toro like image. And so to see that come out of a comic book and then put into a Del Toro movie, I think is just totally perfect.
And I think it's really interesting too how human he makes Hellboy, and I'm
Yes.
sure Mignola did as well. There's another quote from Del Toro where he says, "The carcass of a creature confirms the existence of a living specimen. In the same way, monsters confirm the otherness of all of us." And I think that that's what's really interesting about Hellboy is that he has a level of humanness, but he is this demon, basically a hellspawn. But the very concept of Hellboy, to believe in a hellspawn, means that God and angels are real as well, but they're tangential characters at best in this. But there is a big father figure. You mentioned John Hurt's character earlier. One of the things that I absolutely loved in this movie, watching it again, it's such a small moment, but it's when they go to the museum. And I love the idea that all museums, they come in and they make sure nothing's real, right? That it's all fake replicas and things, because there are things that go bump in the night, and they're the ones who bump back, Hellboy and the crew. But he's walking in and he's cynical, and he's smoking his cigar. And as he's walking up, he says something like, "I thought all this was relics or replicas. We did a search here." And then you hear John Hurt standing up above on this pedestal saying, "Well, there was one that was real." And he looks up, Hellboy looks up at him, and he instinctively takes the hand that has the cigar in it and puts it behind his back and says, "Father, Father." And that's such a really cool, wonderful human moment. And it says something about the presence of fathers, and that this is one of the great fathers that are in Del Toro's work. It's someone who is worthy of being a father and is unfortunately taken away. How much do you think that was Mignola? Was that in the
That's
book?
definitely in the books too, because the death of the professor doesn't come until much later. But there is one of the most famous short stories in the Hellboy canon. It's only 2 pages. It's called Pancakes, and it's when Hellboy was just recovered from hell slash the clutches of the Nazis, and the professor tells Hellboy, "I'm gonna introduce you to pancakes today," and Hellboy's being a very surly little child. No, I don't want pancakes. I don't want pancakes, and they kind of plop, pancakes and butter and syrup in front of him, and he scarfs them all down, and he says, "I love pancakes." And so for Mignola to go through the time and energy to include this very small moment to us in the lives of these, two very strange creatures, this professor working for the U.S. government and this hellspawn, to show that how they were able to connect and find love with each other, I think is extraordinarily important to the character development of Hellboy, but also to the development of Mignola as an artist and the way he is able to engender empathy for this character. And I think it says a lot about the power of nurture over nature and our ability to defy our own destiny, that we do not let fate decide for us. We have a say in what we're supposed to do, even if somebody a million years ago carved our name into a piece of rock. We have a say what that name means.
And I love that you mentioned the pancakes because, of course, pancakes are shown
Yeah.
in the movie. He's so allegedly a cat eater, loves cats. He finds them delicious, and all of a sudden, there's these huge piles of pancakes. And I love that there's these interesting nods that come from a fan. One of the things that I thought was one of the greatest images, talking about the Lovecraftian thing, is when the portal opens in the beginning in the 40s, and one of the Fresnel lights that they have at the area surrounding this strange machine that's going to open up the portal flies in with the suction, and it's floating, this movie light basically floating as if it's in water, and it comes up across this huge eye, this elder god that's out there, and it pulls back. And I thought that is so great, and there are so many wonderful images that are like that in this movie. Being that you're a fan of both the movies and the comic book, what do you think is the main theme or the reason to be for Hellboy? Why does Hellboy exist as a story? What is that monster representing for us?
Well, I think for Mignola personally, it's because he was sick and tired of what Marvel and DC were telling him to do. Because as insane as it may seem now, when he would do things like Batman or Doctor Strange, people would write it and say, "This guy sucks. I hate him." And so he would have to go to editorial and hear about it, and he didn't want to do that anymore. So he decided to, well, what do I like drawing? I like drawing gorillas and squids. So this is the perfect way for him to kind of get his artistic juices onto the page. And so I think this is a distillation of everything that Mignola finds fascinating, and I think that's why it's so fulfilling to read, from a comic book lover's perspective, because it's an artist totally free to do what he wants. Now, obviously, once you get past like issue 1, the difficulty of writing and drawing your own comics becomes clear, and that's why there were some personnel changes later in Hellboy's canon. But it's still such an amazing character to be able to see and grow with, and I think there is a difference between the character in the film, in that he has a love story
Right.
with him and Liz, and that's not really apparent in the comics at all. He develops some deep and sincere friendships with the people at the BPRD, but there's no real love or romance, or certainly a pregnancy that happens with Hellboy. And so in that way, it gives the movies a reason to exist, because telling the story in 2 hours is a much different beast than telling the story over 25 years and 100 issues.
Yeah. I also flat out love in this film that he had the nutsack basically to have 15 minutes of the film in the very beginning go about origin.
Yeah.
And then come up with the rest of the story pre-credits. So there's no credits for like 15 minutes. And then you finally get to this point where you meet Hellboy. I mean, how many minutes go by before we actually see the child, the infant hell creature that is Hellboy? It's got to be at least 10 minutes of these characters that are fantastical. There's insane stuff. There, in fact, the very first 15 minutes of that movie is the climax of most films. That's the end game, you know.
Interrupting the ceremony from the evil Nazis to summon the apocalypse. Yeah, that's your end point.
Yeah, not the beginning of the movie. That's not. Think about getting popcorn, coming in and going, what happened? But I think that's a really enjoyable piece of these. And you mentioned how the second film is more of a Del Toro film. And do you think that it suffers from the poetry? And I don't mean that like the poetry is a bad thing, but there's something very streamlined and very not clockwork, but really strong and sleek about the original Hellboy. And then when we get to the second one, there's a fluidity that is part of the poetry. Do you think that affects it?
Yeah, I think the first Hellboy is a metered rhyming poem, and the second is a free verse poem. I think they're both beautiful films, and I think they are very different. And if the second one doesn't have the streamlined nature of the first, you have the Troll Market, which is an unabashed parade of beautiful effects and gorgeous kind of practical creatures that, me as a cinephile, someone who loves things like Ray Harryhausen or a great monster like that, just, that blows my mind. And the death of the forest elemental in Hellboy 2 is one of the most beautiful sequences I've ever seen in any movie. And it's out of a forest god that like only Del Toro can make that moment happen. And for the beauty of that moment alone, I think it is something that can only happen in a movie like Hellboy 2.
Yeah, I'm so glad. That's what I was going to talk about, the forest elemental, if I had a chance, because that's possibly my favorite monster for what it feels like emotionally that he's ever done. The idea that it's bleeding, and everywhere that this blood, this form of blood goes, plant life starts to grow, that it's so fecund that this thing is just adding, its death is adding life everywhere it goes. And I can't think of a more amazing romantic thought than to have this elemental dying and groaning and gushing, and buildings have plant life growing out of every corner of them because its life's blood is literally life's blood. And I think that's amazing. You mentioned forest elementals. That's a perfect time to get into Pan's Labyrinth.
Sure. Oh, if I could say one more thing about Hellboy that I think a lot of people don't talk about is the character of Myers, who in a lot of movies would be the main character, but in this one he's sort of our eyes into the world, and would be so easy for the filmmaker to have him be shocked at what he sees when he enters the BPRD. But instead, he's fascinated. He's curious. He sees Abe Sapien,
right,
a 150-year-old fishman in a tube, and he approaches him with fascination and curiosity. And he's able to meet Hellboy and gain his trust. Like, he's a guy from off the street and is able to gain the trust of a hell demon. Like, I think for our window into that world, Myers is such a fascinating character that Del Toro doesn't even want to bother with somebody being shocked by Hellboy's appearance. Our window into that world is somebody who appreciates the beauty of these sentient beings, just like the audience should.
And this just goes to show how insane of a chunk of mineral we've decided to take on by going down these movies, because we didn't even mention Abe Sapien, one of the most amazing characters, and one of the first times that this is like, it's not the first time he works with Doug Jones, but this is the first time that he gets like the showcase that He has this wonderful
Yeah.
thing where it's not just a costume, or he can't be called a suit creature. He's literally acting, and it's one of the more intriguing and endearing characters that's in the film, and he's thoroughly alien. So we almost didn't talk about Abe Sapien. This is a nightmare. This show is going to go down in history as the show of missed opportunities. So let's just miss a few more,
Sure,
shall we?
sure.
And go right back to General Franco's Civil War. So Pan's Labyrinth takes place in, I think, around 1939.
That's
And
1944.
1944, thank you. So it's in 1944, a few years after the Civil War, and we've got this victorious, dictator, and we have the resistance that has fled into the forests. And we're talking about how there was a forest elemental in Hellboy 2. Well, this movie is all about elements, and it's all about the forest and what the forest means. And the main character, that the title, at least the title of the movie, comes from the faun, the idea of Pan, this elemental of the woods, this trickster god. So you want to talk a little bit about this movie, give a little bit of an insight in what we're talking about?
Yeah, so this movie, on its surface, is about this little girl Ophelia who comes to live with a captain in Franco's fascist army, because her birth father is dead and her mother has married this kind of ogre of a human being, and she finds through her love of story this kind of doorway into a magical world, and meets the faun, who kind of takes her in and tests her moral fiber in a variety of ever more increasingly bizarre ways, as this sort of kind of apocalyptic confrontation with the resistance has happened on the outskirts of her family compound. And it combines this fantastical, beautiful imagery with some very disturbing gore, eh, in the fantastical and outside of it. And it's sort of this kind of interweaving of mythological themes and real world themes that I think make this movie so incredibly unique.
Yeah, it's a fascinating film, and I love how there's the hard edge of reality in both the fantasy world and in, of course, the reality. And we have a couple things that are staples of Del Toro in here. We've got the dueling father figures, the lost father and the new father, who's a monstrous kind of creature, but he's a human. This fascist, of course, clocks time and that idea of being afraid of precision, being terrified of the purest thought, the most simplistic thought. And we'll see that later in his later films, with this idea of order, that everything that the fascist father loves has to do with order. And he's very big on material things. And there is this wonderful seeming disorder to the forest. There's not a dirtiness, but once again, fecund. We come across this face made out of stone, and the eye is missing out of the stone. Once again, this weird blindness. And Ophelia takes the stone. She finds the piece that's fallen out, and she goes to put it in. And there's this little creature that comes out that becomes part of the story. There's this idea of a much bigger order that will always outlive these small little fiefdoms. And yet nature is very treacherous in this movie. The faun, Pan, is a very treacherous character. The frogs underneath the ground, underneath this big tree, are treacherous. There's the pale man down in this weird lair that's absolutely terrifying and treacherous. So it's almost like he's giving. This may be the closest to fairy tale that I can think of, and yet it has some of the most horrific elements as well, because it almost feels like it's life lessons. This is grim fairy tales as well as some other fairy tales put together, making this story that is literally being a life lesson for this girl as she's living through captivity with this parent. And this parent is going to have a crazy, untimely demise because the forest is full of revolutionaries as well. The resistance is in there. So I think it's an absolutely fascinating storyline. And once again, we have the idea of blindness. I think when you talk about the violent elements of this, the one thing everybody talks about is the bottle.
Yeah.
The smashing of a man's face in. basically his skull, but his face, his eyes. And there are a couple of times when people are tortured and we see their eyes are closed up. This once again, this idea of forcing blindness upon people, and in the end, there's when the comeuppance happens, there's this disturbing thing about getting shot in the cheek and one eye starting to roll
Yeah.
up as if he's been blinded by his own ambitions. What do you think is the purpose of the labyrinth in this film?
Well, I think in this film, it's a way for Ophelia to sort of find her way through the terror that is happening, and through the labyrinth, we're able to kind of meet things like the frog or the pale man, and sort of navigate the nightmare that is Europe in 1944, and we're able to meet all these sort of mythological folk tale and real world images. And I think the image of the pale man is the most sort of singular distillation of Del Toro's sort of oeuvre that you can have, because you have the eye imagery, taken out of this sort of troll figure. We see his eyes on a plate, which is a hagiographic symbol from St. Lucy, and you see this sort of fairy tale, straight from fairy tale banquet on the table to meet the starving Ophelia, who is so in desperate need of food because of her travails through the labyrinth. And you also see the tragedy of the real world literally piled in a corner in the form of
Yeah,
children's shoes, which is a fairy tale image, but also certainly a Holocaust image, because that is happening at that very moment that Ophelia is encountering this figure of myth from 2,000 years ago. So it's everything in sort of this kind of wonderful spinning gyre of horror and blood and sadomasochism, as you see basically Saturn devouring his sons in front of this little girl. It's this labyrinth of imagery.
I think it's really interesting too. I'm glad that you brought up the food because there's this really interesting parallel that happens in that sequence where you have this huge banquet of all of this food. She's not supposed to eat any of it. She has these fairies that are saying, no, 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 do not do this. And then we see the same banquet with fascists all around it.
Exactly, yes.
And they all have to wait to eat. They have to wait till he gets there and tells them that it's okay to eat. And I think that kind of feels like an interesting clue to the film as well, that there's always this parallel coping mechanism with the harsh realities that are in front of us, or in front of Ophelia, which is, of course, in front of us. And I think this talks to intention of the artist, because if you look at it, Pan's Labyrinth is very similar to Brazil, where you have this fantasy sequence to get away from pain. And in the end, it ends poorly. But there's a difference between what we feel in Pan's Labyrinth versus Brazil. I mean, she's shot and wounded and she's laying there, but we get to see altars with these kings and queens and applause for her not sacrificing her brother, her self-sacrifice. Whereas Buttle, on the other hand, in Brazil, has this time of being this winged creature saving everybody, but in the end, he's dead. And we get a hollow feeling with Brazil, but we get this sacrificial goodness that comes in Pan's Labyrinth. And I always think that it's very interesting. People walk out of that movie uplifted, and yet the end is sorrowful. What do you get out of that end?
Uh, I I think you hit on it perfectly, that it's such a tragic end that we see Ophelia die, but we also see a window into another world. We see her witness paradise, basically, because she's promised again and again by the faun, who is a liar, that she's able to get to paradise and meet her real the father and mother if she accomplishes these tasks. And the final task is that she brings him the blood of an innocent. And eventually we get to see that that blood is actually hers. And so she gets to see the spoiler alert, I guess. The the king and queen of the fairy realm, but yet it is so strangely hopeful because we see the magic made real in a sense that this dying wish of this little girl is that there is something more to the world than just fascism and rebels hiding in the forest and murder and your eye being shot out because of your own ambition. There's something to be striven for and believed in than just what is here now, and I think that in itself is uplifting.
Yeah. And I love how the fawn works in this as a device that cements all of this in even the real world, where Vidal, who's the fascist leader, he can't see the fawn. He sees Ophelia speaking to somebody, but he can't see her. So there's like this truth that is completely missed. He's missing the value of life while he's striving to control everything. And I think it's a really intriguing storyline, to say the least, and just fantastic. Even if you don't want to see any of that, just the visual imagery that there is. This may be one of the most rich stories that I can think of visually that I had seen up to that point since earlier. I mean, it kind of reminded me of like, oh my goodness, the original Beauty and the Beast. I'm forgetting who the director is at this point, but that whole odd fantasy of the early Beauty and the Beast, and how rich and ornate it was, and how full of fancy that film was. There's that fancy that is inside of Pan's Labyrinth as well, and just the myths and legends. You're completely drawn in by the story. If you had to try and get someone to watch Pan's Labyrinth that had never seen it, and they're like, "Oh, it's in subtitles," what would you say?
Well, I want to get back to Beauty and the Beast because it's definitely something we need to talk about more. But if I were to have to pitch somebody on Pan's Labyrinth, I would say that this is a movie that is so visually rich that you don't need any words to appreciate the beauty that is on the screen. But it is something that is able to kind of, like with the Pale Man, synthesize so many different points of view and so many different color palettes and ways of thinking and ways of storytelling into one singular narrative, where you take I think Del Toro himself said that like the world at the time, every character is at a crossroads in this movie, and so that is
Mhm.
also part of what the labyrinth represents, and so you get to see the crossroads of everything that makes Del Toro a singular filmmaker expressed in this one movie. And I think to see that from somebody as talented as Guillermo del Toro, I think is something not to be missed.
Excellent. I'm trying to remember. It was Max Opus that did the original Beauty and the Beast in black and white, but he's channeling in my mindset. There's always the palette that Del Toro brings himself, but in certain movies he finds himself, or he's fascinated or enamored with another time frame or another time period of artistry, of filmmaking, and he kind of brings that energy in. And so he has kind of a Beauty and the Beast feel there. But our next film is more Douglas Sirk around the 50s and 60s.
John Cocteau.
John Cocteau. Oh my God, it's killing me that's. Oh, I couldn't think of it. But Cocteau,
I
yeah,
couldn't think of it
I think
either,
he
and it was
kind of.
killing me.
Yeah, that's the problem with doing these things and riffing, right?
Yeah.
But we come to The Shape of Water, which I've written quite a bit about, and I've done podcasts about, because of my initial feelings about it, and also the way this is like this interesting sway that I think happens with Del Toro in the horror community, at least with the horror fans that I know. And when I talk about the horror fans that I know, I'm even including the people I call the Algonquin Roundtable. These are not your traditional fans. These are people who want to see more and want to find more. That there was a real argument about, is this a horror movie? Is this a monster movie? Is this a romance? Is this a romantic comedy? And I
Yes.
think this is where yes, exactly. The hybrid vigor that I love to see in horror is in this movie, and the elements of horror are there. But people were like, it's more of a romance. I'm like, well, why can't a horror movie that centers around a fantasy also have a romance? Horror movies have certainly had emotional depth to them, but love stories have been central to the plots, the Phantom of the Opera and King Kong and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and people will gladly embrace those. But there's been this separation starting without getting too far off of the thing, but Crimson Peak. There was a lot of people who were like split right down the middle on Crimson Peak. There were, and I look at it as you're either a Hammer fan or you're not a Hammer fan. That's what I say about Crimson Peak. This is all about romance and beauty and poetry. And yes, a 12-year-old could figure out the plot. So I still think that it was telling this wonderful, grand, and somewhat violent fantasy. And I think Shape of Water is doing the same kind of thing. It's taking a hybridization and a love of a style of film. And I mean, you're talking about Douglas Sirk films that never talked about what was going on at the time Douglas Sirk films were being made. But this is a Douglas Sirk film that in the background, there are bombs falling out of a B-52 on black and white televisions while people wait at the bus station. This is a movie where no matter how much you try to hide or be blind, it's coming. Whatever is the change, it is coming, whether it be a god, a fish god, or it be the civil rights movement that is on its way. So I think what's interesting about Shape of Water, well, I don't want to, I'm taking over here, and I've written a ton about it, and I can get over passionate about this. So, John, please tell us a little bit about Shape of Water.
Well, I mean, on its surface, The Shape of Water is about this mute woman named Eliza Esposito, and is made a point in the film that Esposito is basically what Italian immigrants were who were orphans were given the last name of. So she's alone.
Mm-hmm.
And unable to really express herself vocally, but through her friendships with her neighbor Giles and Octavia Spencer, her coworker, she's able to really find her voice. And then she works at Occam Advanced Research Labs, where they bring which is kind of a middle finger from Del Toro to that very philosophy of Occam's razor. But they bring in this strange creature from the Black Lagoon, from the darkest Amazon, to experiment on, and they fall in love, as unlikely as that may seem. And as you mentioned before, Beauty and the Beast, like Hellboy, is a reversed Beauty and the Beast story where Liz Sherman, the beauty, becomes the beast instead of the other way around. This Beauty and the Beast story is where the beast stays the beast, and the beauty is perfectly fine with that, and they fall in love despite their vast differences.
To say the least, the vast differences. What I love is, I mean, there's so much to love about this film, and I have to say, when I first saw it, I can't say that I absolutely loved it. You know, when I came out of the theater with my wife, I turned to her and I said, I really like this movie, but this is gonna drop out of sight. There's no way people are gonna rally around this film. And she's like, yeah, I really liked it, but it feels like it was and we missed the point completely. Watching it again, or even days after, when I started to have to defend the fish fucking movie. Oh, that's the movie where she fucks a fish. Yeah, no, it's a god, by the way. She fucks a god. Is that okay?
Yeah.
This.
Speaking of Catholic imagery.
Yeah, right. To know him is to love him. I thought about it, and I realized that I was seeing through the eyes of the 50s scientists, taking something absolutely beautiful and examining it till it dies. And that's kind of what I was doing to Shape of Water when I first saw it, because I sat there and I said, I don't understand. He's such a good director, and he so understands cinema. How could he just have these weird subplots that go nowhere? What's so important about this? What's the Russian thing? What's all of these little weird, what's the pie thing? Why do we have to deal with all these pies in the refrigerator? The movie theater, oh my God, too many things, too many notes for the royal ear. And I found myself not taking in the energy of what he was actually trying to put together there. And I had to admit that. I mean, it's a sincere, super sincere love letter to the outsider. And it's really about communication, true communication that goes beyond words. There's the seeing, and then there's the doing, and there's the ability to communicate without not only a language barrier, but one who cannot speak at all. Definitions, words get in the way, just like all the different genres that are in this movie. I think I saw Del Toro interviewed on Jimmy Kimmel or one of those, and he said, "Did you ever think about making this movie in Spanish?" And a lot of people ask you why he didn't just make this a Spanish film, and he goes, "I think it was weird enough."
Yeah.
And so he's basically saying, you have a musical number, Douglas Sirk, horror movie, love interest, attack on Cold War sensibilities, all wrapped into one film. But I think that words hide all the lies that are in this movie. The main character the monster, Richard Strickland, Michael Shannon's character, is your order, your perfection. He spends time telling people how you need to pick one way to urinate. You either wash your hands before or wash your hands after urination.
We know he's a sicko because he uses a public restroom and then eats candy before he leaves the restroom. What a monster.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Of all the things he does. But you have this, he's full of words and he's full of lies. I think it's a very interesting thing that I didn't mention before, but now that we're at the final film that we're going to talk about, you can see the pattern where there is this self-hatred amongst these fathers of control that go through these films. The character from Pan's Labyrinth, spends time looking in a mirror while he's shaving and then slashes the throat of his image in the mirror. And we have somewhat the same kind of self-hatred being seen in the car, and the way the fingers being bit off, all this weird stuff, him pulling the fingers off of his body. There's an idea that it takes so much to be against reality, so much to be that force of order. When he's sitting there talking about Christ, he goes, he says, that thing in there, that's an aberration. I dragged it all away from the Amazon, and we're not friends anymore. We learned to not be friends on that way. He goes, we are in God is in our image, or we are in God's image. So what do you think he looks like? Do you think God looks like that thing? She goes, well, I don't know what God looks like, which is humane, open way to think. The allowance of doubt, the allowance of faith, to sit there and say, well, I don't know what God looks like. And he goes, nope, looks like me. Looks like me. That's what God looks like. Looks a little bit like you, but probably more like me. to have that kind of straightforward force of nature demanding order, demanding your order on the world, is monstrous. And yet Del Toro takes the time in all of his films to show what a burden that is, that it's eating and killing them as well.
He's a character who hates himself so much, even if he thinks that God looks like him. He can't recognize his gangrenous, decaying limbs on his own hand as they stink and rot, and everyone else around him says, this is disgusting, what is happening to you? And he, rather than go to the doctor and get it fixed, he rips them off from his own flesh. And it's indicative of a lot of Del Toro movies in that there's a few very indelible moments of horror in his movies. So like with Devil's Backbone, there's a spear into the armpit, or the bottle scene in Pan's Labyrinth. So that's one of the inescapable moments of horror in this film. Or when Michael Stuhlbarg's character is shot through the face, another face bullet, and then dragged across sand, grabbed by the bullet wound by the person who shot him.
Yeah.
But I think, what you said about lying through Strickland, he's the character with a voice, and he's somebody who's kind of so abhorrent that he tells his wife while he's having sex with her, I want you silent, as he covers her mouth with his wounded hand. And this is a movie that is told from the perspective of silent characters, and not just Eliza, but from Octavia Spencer's character, who's an African-American woman who spends her home life taking care of a husband who won't even look at her. Then we have Richard Jenkins's character Giles, who was gay in the early 60s, and he's old. which
Yeah.
is something that he feels when he sees a man who he's attracted to, and something he feels whenever he goes to work. He's out of date. His romanticism is passé because this is a world of the future. His artistic expression has no value anymore, and neither does his love. And then you have, of course, this kind of unearthly, beautiful creature from some other place that is totally foreign to these forward-looking America of the early 60s that can't communicate its own beauty and majesty to the people that have captured it. And so it takes these other characters without voice to see the beauty in Doug Jones's performance as the creature itself.
Magnificent performance. The asset.
Yeah,
Can be Amphibian Man, or he's known as the
I
asset
think
in this. I
in
love
in production they called him Charlie.
I love that you talked about Giles, the Richard Jenkins character, because he's kind of our everyman, and he's kind of this moment of change, and he's a denier of who he is in many different ways. Once again, going to the idea of lies. There's early in the movie, he says something that's just such a throwaway line, but it's so beautiful and says something about him and says something about the movie itself, which is, there's a chocolate fire down the street. A chocolate factory is on fire. Do you smell that? And he's like, and he goes, tragedy and delight all in
Yeah.
one. And I was like, oh, that's so beautiful. And it's so him. I love that he's another one who, like the people who ran the orphanage in Devil's Backbone, when the main character Eliza turns on the television and the news is on, he's like, turn that off. That's ugly. That's ugly. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that. She keeps going till she gets to a musical. He knows everything about things that have happened before him, or before the time that's happening now. The work that he does is art, but it's the least common denominator of art. He's forced to make things perfect. He's supposed to show perfect life. He's wearing hair pieces to go get pie because he loves the man who runs the pie shop. And of course, that's a lie as well. The guy's not even from where he says he's from. He's actually from Idaho. Everything about him is an inflection, a deception, basically. And, this whole thing is supporting lies. Everybody is not being themselves to support a lie of an institution that can only thrive if everybody is afraid to be denied common decency because they're an outsider. Everybody is forcing themselves to be an insider that doesn't exist. Everybody is forcing themselves, including who we consider the real bad guy. He's forcing his own life for the real monster, the general, who's all down home cowpoke shucks on the radio and on the phone. And then he shows up and he smiles an ultimatum of death.
Yeah.
And he's basically saying, guess what? You're part of this mechanism. You're replaceable, but this is what it's all about. I am the God who eats his son.
Even Strickland says to him, like, we met each other. I think he says Inchon, and it's been 13 years of flawless service. And so, like, if you meet somebody in the Korean War, you survive war together, and you've served him perfectly for over a decade, and at this one instance he's willing to drop you over one failure, we can at least in that one moment sympathize with Strickland in that he is in a system that creates and caters to real monsters. And I think only Del Toro could give us that moment of sympathy from somebody as unsavory as Strickland.
Yeah, and I think he gives moments like that to the monster in all of his films, the human monster that usually follows the twisted monster that is our patron saints. So I think it's really interesting that Del Toro makes monsters that are on a belief level twisted, and he still gives them absolution in this one tiny spot. And I think that's something that's very intriguing with him, and visuals and taking the sets. I think I had mentioned before how he talked about the bullseye, that the center circle is the fantastic, the monster. And then everything else the set design, the costuming, the color palette, all have to serve that. One of the things that I didn't mention from Pan's Labyrinth that I really loved was how the faun, the first time that we see the faun, he's part of the wall. He's literally camouflaged as part of the cave where the labyrinth is, down this spiral case. And then he pulls out. We're not even seeing him. He's so part of the environment. What do you think water represents? From the first moment the movie starts, we're in an apartment that is completely underwater and sea green. What do you think we're supposed to get from water?
Well, I think the fact that you mentioned the fawn coming out of the wall is really appropriate, because the Japanese woodcut, the Great Wave, is actually hidden in the walls of Eliza's apartment. So even when there is no water, there is water, and water is really supposed to represent like love. That the shape of love is sort of indefinable and ever present and flowing, and it surrounds the characters that we love in this movie, especially Eliza and the creature, and it sort of fills the spaces of their lives and is able to give them meaning and give them support and substance. And so that this really comes into focus at the end in this poem, where that's through some research we think is from Akim Sinai's Book of Everything. And unable to perceive the shape of you, I find you all around me. Your presence fills my eyes with your love. It humbles my heart, for you are everywhere. And Hakim Sinai was really talking about Allah, how Allah is everywhere in all things and everything. But for Eliza, her love for the creature is that. And water is her whole world now. It is everything and always and everywhere. But so is her love of the creature.
So you see water as love, and you're not alone on that. What do you think eggs mean? Egg eating is huge in
Yes,
this
it
film.
is. I think one of the most important sequences in the film is the opening, where within 5 minutes we see our main character masturbating in a tub full of water, but
Right.
she sort of times her morning through an egg timer, and while that egg timer is ticking, she is coming to a climax. And so not only do we see her as a fully formed woman, an adult with her own sex life, she does not need to be awoken by any man, even if it is a fish god. She has her own sex life, she has her own desires and her own drive. And so we see that through the egg timer, which looks like an egg. And so later, when she gives an egg to the creature, it's sort of a callback to that moment, but also a symbol of herself and, like you said, her fertility.
So it's really interesting that it looks as if it's just love and romance of these two widely different characters that come together in the end. But I mentioned that in my mind, this is like the perfect love letter to the outsider,
Mm-hmm.
where we have this monster where in the end, if the god is monstrous, she too becomes a monster to be able to continue to live in the world that has been so violent and horrible to her. To me, the love story is really the love of the outsider that is inside of all of us. I think this movie says that we need to break free from the stigmas. We need to allow ourselves to be seen, that true part of us that we hide underneath everything else. And that showing your true self is super dangerous. You may find yourself ostracized. You may find yourself dead, floating in the water, having to grow some gills really quick. But when you do, even if it is painful, you become something more powerful that cannot be contained, because that's what shape of water means to me. Water takes the shape of whatever container you put it in. In fact, in the very beginning, water is the shape of the inside of an apartment. Then it's the inside of a bathroom. And then it's starting to become the inside of a movie theater as it pours down. You think you know what the shape of water is. We are the water. We are the shape. People think they know what our shape is. But all you need to do is tip that container over and realize that that shape is forced that water will never have a shape, that any shape that you put, any label that you put on things, any limitations that you put on a human being is nothing more than an illusion. And that's the love letter that I see Shape of Water.
See, listener, that's why Scott is the motherfucking master of movie podcasting. Anyway, and I think what you were saying about the outsider is illustrated perfectly in Michael Stuhlbarg's character Hofstetler. He's like a triple outsider.
Yeah.
He's a spy from Russia in America in the 60s. And so automatically he's sort of what almost every American would see as the ultimate boogeyman. But he's on the outs with his spy masters. And not only that, he's on the outs with the people he's spying on at the Research Institute. So he has nowhere where he's not an outsider. He's constantly being bombarded with people telling him he is wrong, he is not right. What he is thinking is not what he should be thinking. And all he wants to do is celebrate the beauty of the nature of this creature and to preserve it and study it. And so when people say what's up with all these subplots, like to me, he Hofstadter is such an important kind of axis upon which this movie revolves that we need him to understand how arbitrary our definition of outsider is, because he's perhaps the most human character in this whole movie, because he sacrifices so much for people he doesn't even know.
Well, I think it's really interesting too. Something that I didn't catch the first couple times I've seen the film, but I saw it in this subsequent watching, where when we first find out that he is a Russian spy, they take him to a Russian tea room, basically. And as they go in, they enter the place, there's nothing but vibrance and joy and singing and smiling faces on the Russians. And every time you see an idyllic, allegedly idyllic situation of the Americans, it's dour. Everybody's pretending to be happy, but they're not happy. And I thought that was really interesting, where you have a real happiness, and this character who you speak of, the outsider, barrels right past all of that into the most uncomfortable conversations he can ever have in the back rooms. He just blows right by, doesn't smile once.
Yeah, and so I think that's part of the tragedy of the character, that even the rarest occasion where a Russian could find happiness in America, he has to ignore it to obey the orders of his masters. And I think it's a really interesting choice in that in those Russian tea rooms, there's no Soviet imagery. It's all Russian folk art from 100 years before the Soviet Union was even founded. And so I think we see the spy work as absurd. Like, you guys are in America eating surf and turf. Why bother with the secrets of this lab? Just like enjoy yourself while you're alive, and go to work and see that you can see the sunrise the next day, because it involves studying an amphibian god from the Amazon. Like, celebrate this moment.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the weirdness and absurdity of the spying. It's an Altman-esque moment in the film when they meet at that, whatever it is, the sand pit, and they're inside, the Russian spies meeting his operative, and it's windy, and they have to stand there even though they know each other.
So
and say the sparrow is.
They have to break protocol to even hear each other say the password, but the password is the same because the meeting place is the same as it has been for the last 20 times they've met.
Right. And so they're saying it and they can't hear each other. What? Over the wind. And then he walks up and he says, it's the same damn thing. I thought that was so wonderful. And it talks once again to the artifice, the artificiality of the lies of order and being able to control every single aspect. What is more controlling than the operative of a spy? When you have to have secrets, when you're hiding secrets. And, Richard Jenkins has his secrets. Everybody has secrets in this movie. And every one of them, there's an absurd nature to trying to hide them. The idea of hiding behind terrible key lime pie to keep your adoration from showing is just unbelievable. So, what do you think if you had to talk to people about Shape of Water and they go, oh, "That's the fish fucking movie, right?" What would you say to change their mind?
I would say that this is this tagline is a fairy tale for troubled times. And I think that's such a fascinating way to market this film because fairy tales came out of troubled times. They came out of like war and starvation and the fears of, male predators kidnapping young girls. And so here we see the paranoia of the 20th and the 21st century kind of made so fine and distilled into one story that we could see it play out, and we can see the beauty in each other and in the outsider, and no matter what kind of obstacles are put in each other's way, we can recognize that even an amphibian fish god can be the source of joy and happiness for us, and we can find that joy in our peers and in movies. And we need to also recognize the pain that outsiders are put through, and we can't just turn it off. We have to open our eyes and open our hearts to the outsiders as well. We can't leave each other behind, and I think this movie really puts that into such a poetic and also really compelling and entertaining way. That's something that only Del Toro can do. And I mean, I can sit here and talk for 2 hours about the way Del Toro makes his movies and the way he tells his stories and his visual cues and his color palette and all this stuff. But even with all that consciously in my brain, he's one of the only filmmakers that can really sweep me off my feet while I'm sitting in the theater, where I can get my brain to shut up and enjoy a great story. And so that's why I'll always love him as a filmmaker. And I hope that I can share that with as many people as I can.
And there couldn't be a better place to end. And that's our look at Guillermo del Toro. It may seem like this was a deep dive, but we've only scratched the surface of what he has done with his career. We didn't talk about his novels. We haven't talked about his television work or his art books full of dreams not yet realized. Dreams not yet realized. My hope is that this episode has a cumulative power to it and that it reminds people of how much they've enjoyed in his work over the decades. And I hope it gives pause to dismissing Guillermo del Toro as someone who no longer speaks for that outsider or the awkward. When he won those Oscars, the celebration was not about golden statues. It was about what those statues represent. Respect for the horror genre and for the horror fan. And Guillermo unlocked that secret door and he told us, kick it in. So I'm looking forward to all the barbarians who make it through that portal to give us more films to celebrate. And I want to thank John Arminio again for being on the show. Thank you so much, John.
It was my pleasure. I could hardly think of a topic I would like to talk about more, but it was an honor.
So is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Perhaps give a shout out to the comic book store that you work at?
I work at Comics Connection, and that's Comics with an X in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. You can find us on social media if you just on Facebook. Like us, and you can stay in tune with what comics are coming out. I'm at Quasar Sniffer on Twitter and Instagram. You can see me talk about podcasts and comics and movies that I love. You can also see me recommend comics that you'd be reading right now. And if I can do a plug for Bradley J. Corners and Dan Poland's 26 Movies from Hell, I'll be on another one of those here pretty soon. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot more dirty jokes in that podcast than this one, but it's still worth listening to. And there's this Ron Perlman quote that I just like to read real fast. So this is Ron Perlman reflecting on Del Toro. Kronos was the first time I experienced true independent cinema. There was magic around Guillermo. He was surrounded by people who loved him, believed in him. I gave him total credit for opening my eyes to what real cinema looks like. That is nothing compared to how profoundly knowing him had changed the course of my life. And so I think that is a beautiful testament to Guillermo del Toro. And so if I could plug anything, it's watch more Guillermo del Toro movies.
And I want to thank everybody who's been listening. If you have your own opinions and gripes and whatever about what you heard today, feel free to get in touch with me at Hellbent Horror. That's my handle on Twitter. You can also write me at scott@hellbentforhorror.com. And we're taking Hellbent for Horror to Burbank, California. I'm having a live author event and book signing at Dark Delicacies in Burbank. How apropos, Guillermo del Toro and a few other fans actually saved this place from going under. They were losing their lease, and Guillermo del Toro went on Twitter and got a bunch of fans together to create a huge auction and create support. So they're just moving locations, but Dark Delicacies, a legendary bookstore, is going to stay alive because of Guillermo's fandom. And I told you horror fans are loyal. But we're going to be doing a live edition of Hellbent for Horror, complete with a reading from my book, Screaming for Pleasure. My very special VIP guest is Heidi Honeycutt, and she's going to be joining me to chat about the book, horror, and her work, and lots more. That's Thursday, April 11th, and that's at Dark Delicacies. The address is 3512 West Magnolia Boulevard in beautiful downtown Burbank. We're going to start that at 7 p.m. And if you want seating it's not a huge place, and it's actually filling up. So you can VIP on an Eventbrite list that I have on my page, on my website, and on my Facebook links that I am consistently showing out there. But on my website, it is the Dark Delicacies page on hellbentforhorror.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area for Montpalooza, don't miss it. I hope to see you there. And until next time, stay hellbent.